Hello and welcome to day 20 of VEDS. I am back from the beach and it is Monday, which means that I need to do a mythology video, but do one that maybe doesn't take as much energy or thought as other ideas that I have. So I've decided to turn to one of the things that got me into mythology and make a video about that. Disney has announced that they are making a television show based on the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. Am I excited? No, because I want to make those. Now I know what you're saying, Disney. Can a person who's only ever made student films jump to a blockbuster project easily? No, you've made the right decision. But I am still bitter. But since I cannot make the Percy Jackson TV show, I will instead give my opinion on who should be cast in the Percy Jackson TV show. And more specifically, who should be cast as the gods in the Percy Jackson TV show. And I'm sticking with the gods because honestly, fan casting children seems weird and uninteresting to me. And I typically follow the case of casting unknowns for your child leads is probably best. So we're just casting all the major Greek gods who appear in the books. Let's get started. Oh, and I'm going to be spoiling things about all of the books, so be warned. And there's of course only one place to start, and that is with Big Papa Zeus. Zeus is a major presence in Percy Jackson, but he doesn't get a lot of character dimension. He's mainly this narrative brick wall that Percy has to run into constantly. So the key thing we're looking for here is someone who has a lot of intimidating presence. We can also take in his description from the book as someone who appears like a New York businessman. And then it just becomes extremely easy to cast just about any actor over like the age of 40 to play Zeus. However, I'm not just going to cast any actor. I'm going to cast a stage actor who admittedly has played another Greek god on stage, but I don't care. I think he would be really good for this, and that is Patrick Page. I have seen Patrick Page perform twice, once as Hades in Hadestown and once as the Green Goblin in Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, and he was amazing both times. Now admittedly, those are both villain characters, and Zeus isn't a villain in these books. He's an antagonist, certainly, but not a villain. However, I can very easily buy Patrick Page toning it down to just play an intimidating presence, taking everything that he does with Hades and just curbing that a little and making it feel a little bit more real for the screen. And let's hop over to another antagonistic force in the first book, Hades. Hades is one of the most interesting gods in the series because he has a moral grayness to him. Percy goes through most of the first book thinking that he's gonna be the big bad, and he's not. However, because of that kind of reputation that is built up for Hades, Hades is going to kind of play into that. So he's never a bad guy, but he has been ostracized to the point where he is going to make inconvenient decisions for the characters. And if we look a little bit ahead in the sequel series, we get to see his Pluto side, which is a bit more suave, a bit more elegant, still very powerful and commanding, but maybe not as much of an antagonist as we get in the main series. So who can juggle all of this? Well, in my opinion, there's really only one person who could, and that is Idris Elba. Elba has played both characters who are morally good and morally bad, and of course characters who are somewhere in between. He also carries himself with a lot of presence in his roles, and I think that he could play the pride that Hades has in himself that drives him to be such an obstacle for Percy and the Olympians. So we've talked about two of the antagonists from the first book, but let's talk about the actual antagonist. Ares pops up in the first book and is a big presence, from him helping Percy and Annabeth and Grover to eventually him fighting Percy. However, he doesn't actually appear that much in the rest of the books. Once again, we can jump ahead to the sequel series and we can see more of his Mars persona and how that conflicts with his Ares persona. However, I think that if we're just going to stick to the Olympian series, then there is more of a kind of macho bravado-ness that we need to capture. So I thought on it a bit, and there are a lot of military types that you could throw in there. However, the name that kept coming back to me was Jack Reynor. Jack Reynor has popped up in a lot of great indie stuff, from the musical Sing Street to the horror film Midsommar. So this would be a very different role for him, but I feel like he could pull it off and he has the look to do it. Plus, he's an actor who I want to see kind of expand into different roles. And next, let's cast the goddess Hera. Hera plays both the role of patron and antagonist in the series. although she always kind of carries with her this condescending, passive-aggressive nature to her. And Hera is someone who, in Percy Jackson, and in most modern adaptations, is just, I don't think it's a fair shake. So I wanted to come up with an actor who, without changing how Hera is portrayed in the books and presumably the TV show, can still bring a certain amount of dignity to the role and self-assuredness to kind of curb the more negative portrayal. So we're not rewriting the character, we're just looking for someone who can really sell it. And for me, that actress is Jean Smart. Jean Smart has done a lot of TV, but I know her best from the television adaptation of Watchmen. In it, she plays Laura Blake, formerly Silk Spectre, and so she plays this veteran superhero who's grizzled and kind of just over it and commands every room that she walks in. Not only is she not there to make friends, it seems like she almost delights in making people angry at her. However, her confidence just makes her so much fun to follow in a character who you really buy into and want to see succeed, which I think makes her perfect for a character like Hera. Next, let's look at the goddess Athena. I love Athena in Percy Jackson. She carries through all of the intelligence and power of her mythological counterpart, but also her role in the story is kind of like Zeus, kind of a brick wall for Percy to bump up against, but for very different reasons. Zeus doesn't like Percy because it's an extension of his rivalry with his brothers, but Athena comes off as someone who's just kind of annoyed that they have to think about Percy at all. Percy lives in Zeus's head rent-free, but Athena does not think about him until he does something stupid and drags her daughter into it. And there are a lot of people, I think, who could play Athena. The challenge here was not finding one person to fit the role, but finding one in the dozen that I could think of that fit the role. And I was kind of flitting between two names, one of them being Catherine Hahn, but eventually I was just like, I can't really justify this, but I'm just gonna go with my gut and say Vicky Krieps. Vicky Krieps had a movie earlier this year, old, but I know her from the Paul Thomas Anderson film, The Phantom Thread. I'll be honest, this is purely based on visuals. She just looks like Athena to me, and so I think it would be cool to see her as Athena. But I also think she can play Athena's intelligence and annoyance at Percy. And next, let's look at Hermes, who's one of the first gods that Percy really ingratiates himself to. Hermes is just very likable, and while later in the series there does become a little bit more conflict between Percy and Hermes, it's never to the level of, let's say, Percy and Zeus or Percy and Hades. So I'm looking at someone who's a little bit younger, can play a very fun type character who could very easily disarm the people around him, kind of like an aspirational older figure, like that kid can look at and see themselves being that person in X amount of years. And so I'm gonna go with Lakeith Stanfield from Atlanta and Sorry to Bother You and a bunch of other things, and someone who has constantly impressed me by being able to play different characters. And even when there are just like subtle variations in those characters, you can always see where he is differentiating himself. And he's just always likable. I don't think I have ever seen Lakeith Stanfield in something where I didn't like him. Sorry to Bother You, he evolves into someone you don't like, but you start out rooting for him. So to me, he seems like the perfect fit for Hermes. And then you've got Dionysus, the god of wine who has been sent to counsel a camp of teenagers as part of his detox program. It's great. I love Dionysus. However, eventually you do kind of start to see Dionysus's more, for lack of a better word, human roots come through. You do start to see his sympathy for his children. And basically, since I first read the books, I've imagined Dionysus as Danny DeVito. However, I feel like he'd be a little bit too distracting. He's a little bit too much of a meme. So I'm gonna go with a person I like to call the more toned down Danny DeVito, and that's Paul Giamatti. Dionysus is supposed to be one of the youngest gods. I don't know why I'm not casting a younger person here, but it's just, I feel like Paul Giamatti could lean into kind of the more frustrated, over-the-top person who is just mad to be stuck watching over all these kids, and then also be able to pull off the more dramatic person who cares about their children that you see later in the series. And now let's look at Demeter, who probably gets the least amount to do in the books. As far as I remember, she only pops up in the 5th book. So I am drawing more on just my interpretation of the mythological Demeter than necessarily the descriptions we're getting in the book. And to cast her, we're going to go back to Phantom Thread and look at Leslie Manville. When I saw her in Phantom Thread, she was playing a character who you think she is going to behave one way the entire movie. You feel like you know exactly what this archetype is. But then she makes a turn, and you see that not only does she have a lot more agency than you at first thought, but also she just has she has a deeper internal thought process than you thought, which is similar to how I often think of Demeter. Demeter is a person who really only gets a lot of play in the Persephone myth. However, you see so much of her in that, from her anger to starving the world to running off and becoming just a wet nurse for this one family at one point, because she misses her child so much, that you start to kind of piece together, and at least for me, get a better idea of who she is. So like I said, not really drawing from any description in the book, just from my personal thoughts on Demeter, I feel like Manville could play the role very well. Now let's cast the twins, Artemis and Apollo. Artemis is tricky because she is the goddess of maidens, so she is young. So you could cast a child actor, but that child actor would probably just grow up, and so it would probably be smarter to cast someone who can just kind of play ageless. And for this, let's go to Maisie Williams. She's probably best known as playing Arya on Game of Thrones. However, I think what really sold me on her as Artemis is her stint in Doctor Who, where she plays a young person who is then given the gift or curse, depending on how you see it, of immortality. So she goes from the point where she gets immortality to the end of the universe looking the same. However, when you get to those episodes of her in the future, she feels like someone who has lived thousands and thousands of years. So I think you can get that here, where she is playing a character who is younger than she is, but has also lived longer. It's a tough balance to hit, but I think she could pull it off. And then her brother Apollo, who is this rock kind of pop star type character in the books, who's just kind of living in the moment. He seems like he's having fun, but he can also be super impulsive. And so I want to cast Phil Dunster from Ted Lasso, who plays kind of the hotshot up and coming football star in that. Apollo seems like a very similar character, just maybe a little bit more intelligent, and obviously Phil Dunster could pull off the comedy that would be required for the character, and I feel like he and Maisie Williams could have enough chemistry that you buy that they are siblings. Next is what I considered to be the hardest god to cast, Aphrodite. Aphrodite is described in the books to kind of change her appearance based on who's looking at her, to reflect their idea of beauty. And this is something that I think plays much better on the page than it would the screen. Because on the page, that allows the reader to kind of project their idea of what she would look like. On the screen, you need a little bit more of a definitive person. If you were trying to do like a shifting type person, I think that'd just be kind of distracting on a TV budget. But that means that you kind of have to decide on what your ideal form of beauty is going to be. So instead, I'm just not going to touch that at all. Instead, I'm looking at someone who can act in many different ways. Someone who could adjust however they're acting against who they are acting against. And I feel like someone who could pull this off is Zoe Kravitz. I think Zoe Kravitz is a very underrated actress who people just don't give enough credit. When you look at her in one particular role, she's usually just doing what the script needs her to do. But when you look at the wide berth of her credits, then you start to see variations in different types of characters. And so I think it would be cool to see her in a role where she's able to do that all within one show. Then you have Hephaestus, who is another one of these gods who Percy seems to get along with fairly well, and another one of these gods who I just kind of have to go with my gut instinct. There is no other option for me here. It has to be Ron Perlman. Not only is Ron Perlman just always a fun actor to see in things, but I think he just looks the part. Ron Perlman walks up to you and says, "I've spent every day of my thousands years life in a forge." I think you'd buy it. And he just has this gruff exterior that I think would really fit with the character. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about Poseidon, Percy's father, and probably the most sympathetic god in the series. And I'll be honest, I could not come up with someone who I think just fit the role really well. Because every time I thought of someone who could play the more mythological aspects of playing the god of the sea and everything that entails, I then thought of them as just Percy's dad and the more dad vibes that you get from Poseidon. And I couldn't think of anyone, so I started thinking of people with the dad vibes and then doing the reverse, and I couldn't think of anyone. Out of the top of my head, I could not cast anyone who fit both of these parts. So I decided to double down on just one of those aspects, and the aspect that has the most narrative function in the books. And that is dad vibes Poseidon. And if I'm gonna cast someone solely off of dad vibes, I'm gonna cast the actor who just, I think, personifies dad vibes. And that is Michael Stuhlbarg. Ever since I saw him in Call Me By Your Name, I'm just like, you a dad. And yes, he's been in a lot of roles that don't exude that energy, like Shirley from last year. However, even there, when I first saw him, I'm like, dad vibes. By the end of the movie, I'm like, bad dad vibes, but still dad vibes. So we're going for it. Mikey, suit up, you're Poseidon now. And finally, we have Goddess of the Hearth and Home, Hestia. Now, we aren't properly introduced to Hestia till the 5th book, but she does actually appear in the very 1st book. And she has 2 forms, one as a child and one as an adult. I'm not going to touch the child version, I'm just going to cast the adult and assume that Hollywood could find a child who looks reasonably like them who could play the couple times she's a kid. And here's what I was going for. Someone who can represent the ideas of hearth and home, so is comforting and someone you want to be around, but also still has that kind of godly, otherworldly presence to them. You want to be around Hestia. She just gives off good vibes. But they're very different vibes than anyone else you've ever been around. And so, who could pull this off? My money is on Rooney Mara. Another indie darling, you may know her from Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or Carol, or Ghost Story. And I think she could just very easily play the more thematic elements of the character, while visually and kind of more subtly bringing in the otherworldly aspect to it. I think out of all of the gods in Percy Jackson, it is most important that Hestia feels divine. And I think Mara could just pull that off nicely. So there you have it, all of the major gods that make appearances in Percy Jackson and who I think should play them. What do you think? Who do you want to see cast in this show? Do you even care? If you don't care, why did you watch this whole video? And with that being said, friends and fellow VEDSies, I will see you tomorrow.